The Holy Gospel this evening comes from St. Luke in the 6th chapter. Then Jesus looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. It's All Saints' Day, and you have these blessings and woes in Luke here, and then it also continues with the story of love your enemies, turning the other cheek. And in order not to get too confused or to give you a 50-minute sermon, we'll try to just focus on the blessings and the woes. Now, in Jesus' time, the blessings and the woes, there was a pretty stark contrast between those who had and those who had not. And for the people who were following Jesus, many of those were in the category of have-nots. And when Jesus says, "You're blessed now, for yours is the kingdom of heaven," this was something they couldn't even really imagine. These blessings that Jesus is talking about were things that they could never even dream of. I mean, it would be the equivalent of the Vikings winning the Super Bowl. You just couldn't possibly imagine something that grand. So when they heard Jesus say these things, they heard them truly as blessings because that was something they were looking for. Now the woes, and by the way, the word woe is not the best translation. Sometimes we get stuck up on this. The word that Jesus is using is the word you'd use when you wanted to say watch out. Like, "Oh, watch out, that's dangerous," or "Watch out, you're getting too close to the edge of the cliff, watch out." Because what Jesus wants people to see is that just because you are not in dire straits right then and there, you still got to watch out. You still got to be careful. Death lurks around the corner for all of us, and so just because you got a car doesn't mean it won't get crashed. That kind of a thing. So watch out. Be aware. And so when Jesus is talking about that, he's talking about blessings and woes. By the time this text gets to us now in 2019, it's a little more complicated. Because if you're really honest to yourself and you look down at the blessings and the woes, you can see that most of us could get one or two out of each section. We could get a couple of blessings here, a couple of woes here. We can always stand to watch out. And there are also times when we've been hungry or when we've been weeping. And we could also hope that there will be a time when that will be no more. So for us, in 2019, as opposed to the folks back in Jesus' time where it was pretty clear you were in one camp or the other, for us it's a lot more mixed. It's a lot less cut and dried. Who's the blessings for and who the woes are for. And in fact, if I would even say that it would be impossible for me to even say anything remotely intelligent unless I stole it from somebody much wiser than I. Because fortunately, about 500 years ago, there was a guy. He was just a regular guy. He happened to be a monk at the time. He thought he would be a lawyer, but he was a monk. And he struggled. Because in his world, too, he could read the blessings and the woes, and sometimes he'd say, "Oh, yeah, that's the blessing part. That's Jesus talking to me." But he'd read the woe part, and he'd say, "Oh, I got to watch out." And it frustrated him because the world he was living in always wanted to put people in one category or the other. It always wanted to say, "Well, you're really poor, so you're not worth anything," or "You're really rich, so you're worth everything." And it frustrated him to no end. And this little guy, he wasn't all that tall, finally had had enough. And on October 31st, 1517, he marched up to the door of his church And he posted on that door 95 Theses because he wanted to shake people from the doldrums of their thinking. And what really frustrated him most about his church was that his church at that time was so stuck in trying to be rich rather than helping the poor, who he called the neighbor. And he wanted everyone to see that when it comes to blessings and woes, we all got all of them all the time. And he coined a phrase. In Latin, it went simul justus et peccator. For you and I, it means we're always saint and sinner. Always saint and sinner. And I don't care what you think about saints. I don't care what you think about sinners, because the most important word of the three words is always. You can't avoid it. Now, I know, as Luther would say, I know we think we can avoid it. I know what the sins are, Pastor. I could pay off our building if I got 10 cents for every time someone told me, your church is going to fall down if I walk through those doors. I've met enough people who are fully conscious of their sin that they are willing to tell me to my face that when they walk into this church, God burned the church down. At least 740,000 of them. And on the other hand, every now and then, not too often, but every now and then, I will run into somebody who's pretty convinced that they are saint-like. Doesn't happen too often, because most of us, especially in our particular tradition of Lutherans, and many of us coming out of a heritage of Germanic or Nordic or Scandinavian tradition, don't like to, get beyond our horizon, so to speak. So we don't talk about it a lot, but every now and then, somebody will say, I'm a saint. But I will just say this. My college roommate, who I had the blessings to visit a couple weeks ago, once said the most famous line about how we deal with sainthood. He said, my grandma is firmly convinced she's a sinner. She just can't ever remember a time she actually did one. That's how we talk about our sainthood. I didn't sin, so I must be a saint. What Luther wanted us to see, and what makes these blessings and woes so problematic, of course, is because they are so intertwined, that we are always saint and sinner. And the minute we try to peg ourselves as one or the other, I'm too sinful to come into your church, Pastor. I'm not sinful enough. I've never sinned. I must be a saint, Pastor. We take all of God's love, all of God's action in our lives, and put it in a nice little box and hide it in our pockets, never to be seen. Because if you claim to know who's a saint and who's a sinner, then you pretty much must be the Lord of heaven and earth. Because the only one who knows is God. Sainthood is a gift by God established by us in baptism that carries through the power of death. And sin is the inescapability of the fact that we are all born in a world where we are slaves to either sin, death, or the devil. And you might be able to tell me, hey, Scott, I don't sin, and Scott, I don't dance with the devil, but I'm pretty sure you're going to die. And if you're going to die, then you're a slave to death. And that causes all kinds of problems. So Luther said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about whether you're a saint or a sinner, because you're always both. Instead, Luther said, let us revel in the grace that God has created us. Let us dance in the love that God has given us. We are created precisely as God created us and wants us to be. And sure, we may not look like our neighbor. We may be tall or short, or maybe even missing a limb or blind, or whatever the case may be. That doesn't matter. God still loves you. And things may not always go your way, and you may find yourselves behind acres of stopped traffic. God still loves you no matter how many times you take his name in vain at that steering wheel. This is the promise of God, that we are loved beyond our wildest imagination, and all our thoughts and machinations about whether we're saints or sinners or whatever just confuses the fact that we're loved by God, always, as we are. Sure, could we be nicer to our neighbors? Yes, we could. Sure, could we be nicer to ourselves? Most definitely. But Monday morning rolls around, and you got to go to work, and your coworker's an idiot. What are you going to do? You might slip up. That's life. And to be so embroiled in who's a sinner and who's a saint, who's worthy or who's not worthy of being loved by God, misses the point that we are loved by God eternally and totally. I've been waiting 30 years to tell this next story. The only person who's ever heard it is my wife. We have a magazine called The Living Lutheran. I was going to bring it here. I forgot. It's sitting in the office. I read it every month, and the first thing I read every month is the necrology. That is, my colleagues who have died. And the issue for November came a couple days ago, and I read it, and one of my colleagues died. And this man is famous to me in a way that he never knew. Because you see, when I was training and wanting to be a pastor, the way the LCA at that time, soon to be the ELCA, did it is you had to do a whole bunch of tests. You had to do tests of psychological suitabilities, Myers-Briggs personality tests, all kinds of tests. And I was down, many of you know, I came from the University of Texas at Austin, where I was doing graduate school, to go up to Chicago to do seminary. And so I did a lot of those tests while I was down in Texas, and then they forwarded them up to me, and I went into Chicago and started in January of that year. Well, that spring, I went back on spring break back to Minneapolis, which was my home synod, and they wanted to interview me. They wanted to interview me about my psychological fitness to be a pastor. And you already know where this one's going. And the guy who interviewed me, he recently passed away. May he rest in peace. Great guy, wonderful guy. And we had a conversation, about an hour, about my psychological fitness to be a pastor. And he wrote up a report to give to my bishop and to the candidacy committees and other people in the LCA to see. And in it, he said, Scott has the capacities to be a good pastor. And I thought that was overshooting the mark. I'd settle for middle of the road, slightly below average. But if I could be a good pastor, I've always aspired to that. So he's always given me that aspiration, and someday I hope to fulfill that one, to be a good pastor. But he didn't stop there. He then went on to say that Mr. Fredrickson has a bit of an edge to him. And I fear that he will always push the church and not always respect its boundaries. And as his example he's used, he came to this interview dressed in jeans and cowboy boots. Now, I just came from Texas, where jeans and cowboy boots is formal attire. And I even had on black jeans, which meant somebody must have died. I mean, I looked at that, and they sent me the copy, and I was like, this is on my permanent record. That I might not be a good pastor because I wore cowboy boots and jeans to an interview. What if he would have found out about my Birkenstocks? And I got to be honest with you, 2 days before that interview was the last time I cut my hair. He never saw this. What I wished he would have said was not that I would have been a good pastor or that I had the propensity to push the envelope or to be able to kind of work around some of the edges and boundaries of the church, which, by the way, in case you haven't figured it out, are true. I wished he would have said that this guy, even though he wore jeans and cowboy boots to an interview, even though he might be a good pastor, even though he might push the boundaries of the church, he loved Jesus and he trusted God. I've spent the last 30 years of my life not worrying about how my hair looks, what shoes I wear, or whether I have pushed a boundary of the church too far. I have spent the last 30 years of my life trying to love Jesus and trying to trust God. You can call me a saint, you call me a sinner, I really don't care. Because what matters is the always. That we are always loved by God beyond our wildest imagination. When we're being a saint, when we're being a sinner, and every moment in between. Saints and sinners, they come and go. The love of God is eternal and forever, always.